The nuclear watchdog that was supposed to protect the world just told us America bombed a facility. It was monitoring. Monday, they said nothing happened. Tuesday, in satellite images, proved everything. 6 American soldiers already dead. 3 F-35s gone. And Iran hasn't even started yet. What comes next will not stay in the Middle East. It is already moving toward your business, your economy, your future, and most people have absolutely no idea what is really happening. Welcome back, my friend, to your OG John A.G., where we don't just watch history unfold, we decode it before it decodes us. Now listen, if you haven't subscribed yet, I want you to do something for me. You know that feeling. When your grandchildren ask you, "Did you see this coming?" Be the one who says, "Yes, I was there, I was watching." Hit that subscribe button. Think of it as your pension plan for staying informed. And before we go any further, drop a comment right now. Where in the world are you watching this from? Because this story affects every city, every market, every boardroom on this planet. On Monday morning, the world woke up to a carefully worded statement. Rafael Grossi, the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, stood before reporters in Vienna, Austria. Cameras were rolling. The entire world was listening, and his words were measured, calm, and diplomatic. Based on information available, we have no indication of damage to nuclear installations. The world exhaled. Governments relaxed. Markets steadied. Analysts filed their reports. The global business community told itself, whatever happened over the weekend in Iran, at least the nuclear facilities were untouched. At least that line had not been crossed. But that exhale lasted exactly 24 hours. Because on Tuesday morning, March 3rd, 2026, the IAEA did something that international organizations almost never do. They reversed themselves completely. The agency posted a quiet update to social media. No press conference, no dramatic announcement, just satellite imagery and 7 devastating sentences. And those sentences confirmed what Monday's statement had carefully avoided saying. The Natanz fuel enrichment plant, Iran's most important underground nuclear facility, had been struck. Entrance buildings were damaged. 2 visible impact points were identified. The damage occurred sometime between Sunday afternoon and early Monday morning. The IAEA, the United Nations nuclear watchdog, had just confirmed that America bombed a nuclear facility it was actively monitoring. Now, to understand why this moment matters far beyond the headlines, one must understand what the IAEA actually is and what its safeguard system actually does. The IAEA was created in 1957 with one fundamental purpose: to ensure that nuclear technology was never weaponized beyond the countries that already possessed it. Every country that signs the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty agrees to allow IAEA inspectors into their nuclear facilities. Iran was one of those countries. America funds the IAEA and cooperates with its inspection regime. In other words, both countries were operating inside the same international system. And on Sunday, one of them bombed the other's nuclear facility while inspectors were monitoring it. There is no rulebook for this. There is no precedent in international law. There is no emergency protocol that covers this specific situation. Because the architects of the post-World War II international order never imagined that a country funding the nuclear watchdog would bomb a facility that Watchdog was protecting. This is not a regional conflict anymore. This is a structural fracture. And for the global business community, structural fractures have consequences that no spreadsheet can fully predict. Consider what Natanz represents economically. It is not just a military target. It is the centerpiece of Iran's nuclear program, a facility buried deep underground, designed to survive conventional attack. The fact that it was struck successfully tells global energy markets one thing immediately. This operation was planned. This was not impulsive. And where there is one planned strike on a nuclear facility, there is almost certainly a second decision already made. Energy traders understood this before most governments had finished reading the IAEA statement. Brent crude began moving within minutes of the update going live. Insurance premiums on cargo ships passing through the Persian Gulf, already elevated, moved again. Shipping companies operating in the region began quietly reviewing their contingency protocols. Because the business community knows something that political commentators often miss. It is never the bomb that destroys an economy. It is the uncertainty that follows the bomb. When institutions that were built to provide certainty, like the IAEA, are forced to reverse their own assessments within 24 hours, the message to every serious investor, every logistics operator, every energy-dependent manufacturer is the same. The information you are receiving cannot be trusted in real time. And when information cannot be trusted, decisions cannot be made with confidence. And capital does what capital always does when confidence disappears. It moves, it hides, or it repositions entirely. The IAEA's Tuesday confirmation was not just a news update. It was the moment this conflict stopped being something the world could watch from a safe distance. And for the business community, the clock started ticking on Tuesday morning. They did not panic. That is the first thing serious analysts noticed. When a country loses its most important nuclear facility to a foreign airstrike, the natural expectation is chaos, anger, disorder, an emotional, uncoordinated reaction that reveals vulnerability. Iran gave the world none of that. What Iran gave the world instead was geometry. Precise, calculated, deliberate. Every single response that followed the Natanz strike was chosen carefully, not to start a war, but to define the terms of one. And for the global business community, that distinction is not a small detail. It is everything. 6 American soldiers died in Kuwait. Read that sentence again slowly. Not in Iran, not at the border, not in a war zone that anyone had officially declared. In Kuwait, a country that hosts American military bases, a country that has maintained one of the most stable relationships with Washington in the entire Middle East, a country where American soldiers felt relatively safe. Iran chose Kuwait deliberately because the message was not just military, the message was geographic. It told every American ally in the region, every government that had quietly supported or quietly allowed or quietly looked away from the Natanz operation, that proximity to America was no longer a shield. It was a target. Then came the F-35s. 3 of America's most advanced fighter jets, the F-35, a 5th-generation stealth aircraft that costs over $100 million per unit, were shot down. But the detail that stopped military analysts mid-sentence was not the shootdown itself. It was the cause. Friendly fire during an Iranian missile attack. Iran did not shoot down 3 F-35s directly. Iran launched a missile attack so complex, so layered, so deliberately designed to overwhelm response systems that American forces accidentally destroyed their own aircraft in the chaos of defending against it. This is not a military embarrassment. This is a demonstration. Iran was telling the world, and more specifically, telling the defense industry, the insurance markets, and the foreign policy establishments of every NATO-adjacent nation that the most expensive weapon system in American military history is not invulnerable under real combat pressure. Defense stocks moved on that information before most morning briefings had even begun. The U.S. Embassy compound in Saudi Arabia was the third signal, and this one carried the heaviest economic weight of all. Saudi Arabia is not simply an American ally. Saudi Arabia is the architectural foundation of the petrodollar system, the arrangement by which global oil trade is conducted in American dollars, giving the United States extraordinary influence over the world economy. When Iran strikes American infrastructure inside Saudi territory, it is not attacking a building. It is knocking on the door of the entire dollar-denominated financial system. Every sovereign wealth fund manager in the Gulf understood that signal instantly. Every oil trader watching the board understood it. Every central bank with significant dollar reserves understood it. The question being asked in every serious financial institution on Tuesday was not, will this escalate? The question was, how do we position before it does? And then Iran released something unexpected. Images, claiming that 165 schoolgirls had been killed, buried in mass graves in Tehran as a result of the American strikes. The claim has not been independently verified. The numbers may be disputed. The circumstances remain unclear. But the release of those images was not about facts. It was about narrative. Iran was not just fighting a military war. It was fighting an information war simultaneously, targeting international public opinion, targeting the domestic populations of American allies, targeting the moral confidence of governments that had supported or tolerated the Natanz operation. Because in modern conflict, the side that loses the narrative eventually loses the resources. And without resources, even the strongest military position collapses. 6 soldiers, 3 jets, 1 embassy, 1 set of images. None of these responses were accidental. None of them were emotional. Each one was a carefully placed piece in a much larger strategic architecture. Iran was not reacting to America. Iran was responding. And for every business leader, every investor, every entrepreneur watching this unfold, the difference between a reaction and a response is the difference between a skirmish and a restructuring of the world order. There's a moment in every collapsing system when the institution designed to prevent the collapse becomes the proof that it has already happened. That moment arrived on Tuesday, March 3rd, 2026. Not on a battlefield, not in a missile launch, not in the ruins of an embassy compound. It arrived in a conference room in Vienna, Austria, inside the headquarters of the International Atomic Energy Agency, where diplomats in expensive suits suddenly realized that the rulebook they had been quoting for decades had just become fiction. To understand what happened inside that building, one must go back exactly one day, Monday morning. The IAEA Board of Governors convened an emergency session. This is a rare event. The board does not gather in emergency format unless something has fundamentally threatened the nuclear order. Russia had called the meeting, and Russia's argument was specific, pointed, and strategically constructed. Russia was not simply expressing outrage. Russia was building a legal case. Their position was clear. If America had bombed Iranian nuclear facilities that were under active IAEA safeguards, then the United States had not just attacked Iran. It had attacked the entire safeguard system. It had attacked the foundational agreement that separates nuclear-monitored states from nuclear outlaw states. It had, in Russia's framing, made the IAEA irrelevant. But here is where the story becomes extraordinary. During that Monday emergency session, Grossi told the board that no damage to nuclear facilities had been confirmed. So the entire session, every argument, every counter-argument, every diplomatic position staked by every nation in that room, was built on incomplete information. Russia was arguing that America bombed a safeguarded facility. America's allies were defending against that accusation. And the Director General of the IAEA was telling both sides there was nothing confirmed to argue about. 24 hours later, the IAEA confirmed everything Russia had accused America of doing. Now pause and consider what that sequence of events means. Not emotionally, not politically, but structurally. An emergency session of the most important nuclear governance body on Earth was conducted, debated, and concluded based on information that was either incomplete or incorrect. And the correction did not come from intelligence agencies. It did not come from whistleblowers or investigative journalists. It came from satellite imagery, publicly available, commercially accessible, posted to social media. The world's premier nuclear institution was behind the satellites, behind the timeline, behind the reality on the ground. And when the institution responsible for providing certainty in the nuclear space cannot keep pace with events as they unfold, the certainty it was built to provide disappears entirely. For the global investment community, this is not an abstract concern. International institutions serve one deeply practical economic function that rarely gets discussed in business schools. They create predictability. When the IAEA monitors a facility, markets know that facility exists, what it contains, and roughly what its status is. That knowledge is priced into energy contracts, shipping routes, regional investment frameworks, and sovereign risk assessments. When the IAEA's own assessments prove unreliable within a 24-hour window, that pricing becomes guesswork, and markets do not function on guesswork. They seize. They reprice violently. They punish anyone who held a position based on the old certainty. Every pension fund with Middle East energy exposure felt Tuesday's IAEA reversal in ways that never made the headlines. Every infrastructure investor with Gulf region commitments quietly recalculated their risk models. Every reinsurance company covering maritime assets in the Persian Gulf corridor opened a new spreadsheet. Russia, meanwhile, was not finished. With Tuesday's confirmation now public, Moscow had everything it needed to demand a second emergency session of the IAEA board. This time with satellite evidence, this time with the IAEA's own reversal as the opening argument. This time with the moral and legal architecture of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty itself as the backdrop. Russia was not doing this out of loyalty to Iran. Russia was doing this because a weakened IAEA, a discredited safeguard system, an international nuclear order shown to be unenforceable, serves Russian strategic interests in ways that no military operation could achieve. Because when the rules no longer apply to the most powerful country in the room, they no longer apply to anyone. And that realization, spreading quietly through foreign ministries, central banks, and boardrooms across the world on Tuesday evening, was more dangerous than any missile. Because missiles destroy buildings, but the death of institutional credibility destroys the invisible architecture that holds the entire global economy together. And on Tuesday, March 3rd, 2026, that architecture developed a crack that no emergency session can repair. History does not announce itself. It never sends a formal letter. It never schedules a meeting. It never gives serious people enough time to prepare before it arrives and rearranges everything they thought they understood about how the world works. But history does leave patterns. And for those trained to read those patterns, the events of March the 2nd and 3rd, 2026 were not simply a military escalation in a distant region. They were the opening chapter of an economic restructuring event, the kind that happens perhaps 3 or 4 times in a century, the kind that destroys certain industries completely and builds entirely new ones in their place. The question for every serious business mind watching this unfold was never, will this affect me? The question was always, how fast? To understand the answer, one must study what previous Middle East conflicts actually did to the global economy. Not what the headlines said they did, but what the data revealed years later. When the 1973 Arab oil embargo hit, most Western businesses believed it was a temporary supply disruption, a political gesture, something that would resolve itself within weeks. What it actually did was permanently restructure the global energy industry accelerate the development of North Sea oil fields, birth the modern strategic petroleum reserve system, and fundamentally alter the relationship between energy and national security for every industrialized economy on Earth. The businesses that survived and thrived were not the ones that waited for the disruption to end. They were the ones that understood, in real time, that the disruption was the new reality. March 3rd, 2026, presented a similar inflection point across multiple sectors simultaneously. In the energy markets, the mathematics were already brutal before Tuesday's confirmation. Iran sits on the fourth largest proven oil reserves on Earth. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which approximately 20% of the world's oil supply travels daily, runs directly along Iran's coastline. Iran does not need to close the strait to devastate energy markets. It simply needs to make closure credible. And on Tuesday morning, closure became very credible indeed. Every long-term energy contract written before Sunday's strikes was now priced on assumptions that no longer existed. Every manufacturing business that had locked in fuel costs for the next 12 months was now exposed to a repricing event it had not modeled. Every airline, every shipping company, every logistics operator dependent on stable fuel costs was quietly doing the same calculation and arriving at the same uncomfortable answer. In the defense and insurance sectors, the story was different but equally significant. The shootdown of 3 F-35 fighter jets did something that decades of defense industry marketing had carefully avoided. It introduced public doubt about the invulnerability of premium Western military hardware. Defense contracts are not just government agreements, they are investor confidence instruments. When the most expensive weapon system in American history is shown to have exploitable vulnerabilities under real combat conditions, the entire valuation framework of the companies that build those systems requires recalibration. Meanwhile, Lloyd's of London and the global reinsurance market were processing an entirely new risk landscape. War risk premiums on vessels transiting the Gulf of Oman and Arabian Sea began moving in ways that immediately affected shipping costs for goods that had nothing to do with oil: electronics, pharmaceuticals, agricultural commodities, consumer goods manufactured in Asia and destined for European and American markets. War in the Middle East does not stay in the Middle East. It travels inside every shipping container on every ocean. And beneath all of this, the currency markets were asking the question that nobody in polite financial circles wanted to ask out loud. The strike on the U.S. Embassy compound in Saudi Arabia had placed the petrodollar arrangement under visible stress for the first time in decades. Saudi Arabia's willingness to price oil exclusively in American dollars has been the quiet foundation of dollar dominance since 1974. If that arrangement becomes politically unstable, if Saudi Arabia begins quietly exploring alternatives to protect its own interests, the downstream consequences for dollar-denominated debt, American borrowing costs, and global reserve currency dynamics would dwarf every other economic effect of this conflict combined. Serious capital understood this, and serious capital was already moving. For entrepreneurs and business leaders navigating this environment, the framework is not complicated, but it requires honesty. Businesses built on stable energy costs needed a plan B immediately. Supply chains with single-source dependencies in vulnerable regions needed accelerated diversification. Any operation carrying unhedged currency exposure to Gulf-linked economies needed to revisit those positions before the week was finished. But beyond the defensive measures, opportunity was also being created. It always is. Domestic energy producers, defense technology companies outside traditional procurement channels, alternative shipping route operators, commodity storage businesses, regional insurance alternatives. Every structural disruption of this magnitude creates a vacuum, and vacuums in business are always filled by someone. The most dangerous assumption any business leader could make on Tuesday, March 3rd, 2026, was that this was someone else's problem, that the bombs fell far away, that the diplomatic collapse happened in a conference room in Vienna, that the missiles and the dead soldiers and the shattered embassy were contained inside a television screen. They were not. They were traveling through the oil price, through the shipping lane, through the insurance premium, through the currency rate, through the supply chain, directly toward every business, every investment portfolio, every economic plan, built on the assumption that the world would remain the way it was before Sunday.